Well, hey, welcome back to 316, a Bible study from Bridgeway Church in the Tampa, Florida area. My name is Joel Eason, and I'm thrilled that you're with us. Want to take a quick moment to welcome anybody that might be coming across this channel for the first time. Maybe you've recently begun attending Bridgeway. We're excited that you're doing these studies with us or looking into them, or maybe you're just finding us online. We're very honored that you're with us. We'd love to have you subscribe to this channel simply because we put this content out every week, as well as our Sunday services are streamed online here, and we'd love to have you be a part of Bridgeway and connect with what God is doing. I will highlight what I frequently do for those who are new with us, why we call it 316. All of these were built initially many years ago from 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16 and 17, reminding us that all Scripture is God-breathed, and there's so much benefit to trying to do a verse-by-verse study where you can, and in this platform we're able to do a verse-by-verse walk through the Scriptures. So we've gone through the Gospels, we've gone through all of Paul's letters, we have gone through the prophets, we're back running through the book of Romans again, and we're just honored that you're with us, because as we study, as we see from 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16 and 17, that it's profitable in our lives for a variety of things like rebuke and correction, for training in righteousness, that we can be taught and directed, fully equipped for what God has for us. And so we're honored that you're with us for this particular study. Now I'm going to go ahead and hop over because we've got a lot of content to cover. As I said, we're in the book of Romans. We find ourselves specifically in chapter 11 in this study. And sometimes it helps to kind of see kind of in a overview or a summary of where we are. And this is something that we've used as we've gone through the book of Romans so far. We find ourselves in a section of sovereignty where chapter 9, chapter 10, and chapter 11 are dealing with the sovereignty of God. And pertaining to different aspects of that sovereignty, as you'll see in chapter 9 through 11, it's dealing as a totality with Jews and Gentiles. That's what Paul's writing to. But when we look at chapter 9, he is outlining God's been faithful in his sovereignty, God's righteous in his sovereignty, God's been just in his sovereignty, but he's also been gracious. And so when we read about what God has done for the Jewish people and the Gentiles in these facets, we're able to also process how he is sovereign in our lives, how he is righteous and just, he's faithful in all regards, he's gracious. And then in chapter 10, he zeroes in primarily around Israel and dealing with his sovereignty for the Jewish people. And now that we're in chapter 11, he's actually going to be speaking to both Jews and Gentiles, and we have quite a bit to say about all of this. I will say that I think it's helpful to kind of understand where this is building. So when you come off of this primarily talking to Israel in chapter 10 and coming into Israel and Gentiles, one of the big questions that was outstanding for them, as well as still holds to this day, is what is God's position towards the Jew? What is God's position towards Israel? Is he still embracing and sovereignly in covenant with Israel, or has he separated from Israel? And we're going to get into a theory that is fairly common amongst Christian communities today that probably does not have the biblical backing, but we'll touch on that when we get there. But chapter 10 is going to finish with a statement, but concerning Israel, he says, all day long I've held out my hands to a disobedient, obstinate people. That's how chapter 10 is finishing. And then in chapter 11, Paul is going to ask the question, did God reject his people? And he's going to give a definitive answer, by no means. He's going to raise that kind of question 2 times in chapter 11, and he's going to give the same answer, that God has not lifted his hand off of Israel, even if he has been just towards them. Remember, he is always faithful, he's always righteous, he's also always just, and he's also always gracious. And I think those components that we saw in chapter 9 show up also in chapter 11. So Romans chapter 11, he says, I ask then, did God reject his people? By no means. That's really important. No matter what anybody says in today's culture, Paul would say that God has not separated himself, being rejected permanently, Israel. And he's going to give some defense of some things. He says, I'm an Israelite myself, a descendant of Abraham from the tribe of Benjamin. Now, just a couple of things real quick before we kind of go any further. Paul has a deep sentiment for Israel. He has a deep sentiment for the Jewish people because he is one of them. He is also able to talk to the Gentiles in Rome because he is a Roman citizen. So I won't have this in a way of a graph or anything for you, but when we read the words of the Apostle Paul going at the end of the book of Acts, when he is giving his defense of himself, so you look at Acts chapter 22 and into Acts chapter 23 and 24, he's giving a defense of himself, and he's going to give his history. And he's going to talk about that he is from Tarsus. Cilicia is specifically the spot. And when you look at a map, that is just north of, it's at the northeastern tip of the Mediterranean Sea. It's just north of Syria. And it's here that he is born into, he has the birthright of Roman citizenship. He's going to define that. He'll say that also in his letter with Galatia to the church in Galatia, and he's defending his Roman nature, but he also says, "I'm a Jew by birth, by my bloodline." So he's by birthright a Roman citizen. By bloodline, he's Jewish. He would study under Gamaliel, which we'll see him in a little bit. He'd study under Gamaliel actually in Jerusalem, and Gamaliel was one of the prominent top teachers. Now, this tells us a few things. Paul would have spoken Aramaic, which was the common language of the Jews in Israel. He would have spoken Hebrew because that was the studied scripture, the studied language, certainly with Gamaliel. He would have spoken Greek because that was the language around Syria and up into Cilicia and Tarsus. He also would have spoken Latin because he was a Roman citizen and had that influence. And so we know that he has the ability to speak to Jews and also to the Gentiles that happen to be in Rome. And he's going to indicate in earlier chapters, chapter 9 and 10, his heart for his people. He says in chapter 9, verse 2, I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart, for I could wish that I myself were cursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers, those of my own race, the people of Israel. So he is very clear that he is an Israelite. So brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for the Israelites is that they may be saved. So when you look at Romans chapter 9, 10, 11, it's very emotional for Paul. He has a deep heart for his people, but he also has a heart for the Gentile because, as we're going to see in a second, he's an apostle sent to the Gentiles, and he wants all Gentiles to be saved. So here's the question that was coming up between the Gentiles towards the Jews. Are they rejected? And the Jews would have asked that of Paul, are you insinuating that God has rejected us as a people? So let's lean into it because we're going to dive deeper on it. God did not reject his people whom he foreknew. So he's talking about Israel as a totality, the Jewish people. Don't you know what the scripture says in the passage about Elijah, how he appealed to God against Israel? Lord, they have called your prophets and torn down your altars. I'm the only one left, and they're trying to kill me. Now, let's pause. This is where, this is the story that's happening with Elijah. So it's going to continue. And what was God's answer to him? I have reserved for myself 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too, at the present time, there's a remnant chosen by grace, and if by grace, then it's no longer by works. If it were, grace would no longer be grace. So let's just kind of talk about this. You probably are familiar with the story in 1 Kings chapter 19. There's been this real famous battle at Mount Carmel between Elijah and the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Asherah. And there's this really dramatic, victory for Elijah and the people of God. But then you know that Jezebel's going to put a threat. She's going to put basically a bounty on his head. And it's going to cause Elijah to flee that area. And we read about this flight in chapter 18, 19. And he's going to come to this place that he's going to be out in distant country. We don't need to see a map for this, but he's out in very distant country, and he's going to have an exchange with the Lord, and he's very bothered. He's very angry, and he's going to say basically to the Lord, you should kill me because I'm the only one. I'm the only one who's standing for truth. I'm the only one who's standing for your name. And you probably remember the story that God is basically going to rebuke him and say that I have 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. Just because you don't see them doesn't mean they're not there. And there's this concept that we see in this particular story, as well as in some other places throughout the Old Testament, and it shows up in the New Testament here as well. The concept of a remnant, where God always holds a remnant of people. Now, we'll see that same concept if we were to do a deep dive in the book of Revelation and study of end times, that God preserves a remnant. And so he is indicating that just like, even though there were very arduous times for Israel back with Ahab, but God preserved a remnant, so too God preserves those that he has chosen to be the recipients of grace. And that's simply what it is. It's grace. It's not by works. It's not by anything they do by their efforts. It's not by their biology. We're not saved because we're of an ethnic background. We're not saved because of our biology. We're saved by grace. This will come into both Jews and Gentiles in just a moment, you'll see. What then? What Israel sought so earnestly, it did not obtain. But the elect did, being the ones that were chosen, the remnant. He still talked in Jewish. The others were hardened. So of the Jewish community, of the Israelites, in their history, there was always remnants. As a people, they were chosen. As a people, they sought, let's say, the Lord, or sought the blessings of the Lord, but not all did so with faith. Not all did so in a righteous way. And so it says here that the others, those who had rejected the Lord, were hardened. We're going to push into this in a second. As it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes so that they could not see, and ears so they could not hear to this very day. So let's talk about that for a second, because there's a concept here. So the word here for stupor was a Greek word that really carried the visual of blindness. So no pun intended with that, but it was the idea that there is the lack of ability to see. So gave them a spirit, not so much of laziness, but of blindness. So we'll find with Paul's letters, there are numerous times that he'll talk about blindness. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4, the God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers that they cannot know and accept the truth. There's a visual of when God is rejected, that there's a blindness upon people. So God, it sounds like God gave them blindness. So what's at play here? Others were hardened. God gave them a spirit of stupor or blindness. There are sometimes that there is language that almost can be confused or sounds like it can be very confusing, like God is insinuating or instigating, that's a better word, instigating some form of maliciousness towards his people. Like, for instance, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Or with King Saul, God sent an evil spirit. So it looks like that God is behaving maliciously, but that's not what's at play at all. The picture that is used in all of these contexts is that God sovereignly allows, and it's not that he is powerless, it's that he is sovereign, and there are things that are allowed under his jurisdiction, under his sovereignty. I'll give you what will be probably a really poor illustration. I have two dogs at home, and those dogs are dead set on some certain things that are not good for them. So they will want certain foods that maybe our family can eat without getting sick, but it will get our dogs sick. I know that if I take these table scraps and I give it to the dogs, that they're going to vomit. I hate to be gross, but that's what will happen. They'll get sick. They will want it, and sometimes they have made their way into the trash can to get that which I was saying no to. They force their way in, when no one's around, get into the trash can, get those bones or get those things, and then what is the end result? They're sick, they're vomiting. As the owner of these dogs who cares about them, I say no to them. Well, there are times that, let's say, the dogs will want something, and I know it's not going to be what they want, but I'll still allow them. Let's say, for instance, they want outside, but I know you're not going to want to be outside right now because it's either, about to lightning, it's about to storm, or it's really hot or whatever. And then, sure enough, they turn around and they're scratching at the door. The idea here that I'm pushing on is God sovereignly knows all things, and he knows that when a person's heart is already hard or is hardening towards him, there are times that the Lord will allow that to come. So when it says that God gave them a spirit of stupor, a spirit of blindness, he rewards them with that which they were pursuing. They were pursuing rejecting him, and he allows them to be the recipient of the byproduct of rejection, which would have been blindness. And so he's pushing into part of Israel, or part of Israel's history was to reject the Lord. Now let's lean into some things. Paul leans into David here. He says, and David says, may their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. May their eyes be darkened so they cannot see, and their backs be bent forever. Now let's lean on that for a second. So David is very, very, very much pro-Israel. I mean, David is the great king of Israel, right? He was the second king, the one following King Saul, and he was the iconic king that Israel had. He is very, very, very pro-Israel. He is very much pro-God before he is pro-Israel. So when David writes in his Psalms, there are numerous times that he has very harsh things to say about those amongst his brothers who were wicked. David in the book of Psalms does not say that our biology and the fact that we are Jewish by birthright, that is a open skate for us to behave, or you to behave however you want. He's very clear, Lord, bless the righteous and judge the wicked, even amongst our own people. You cannot look at the book of Psalms and say that it's pro-Israel over being pro-God. So what Paul is doing here is he's pulling into this reality that just like David understood that there's righteousness and there's wickedness even amongst our brothers, well, that has been handled by the Lord. So he says this, again I ask, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? No, not at all. Rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. So let me talk about that. So Paul, coming off of the statements of David, Paul has access to something that David does not, and that is history. David in the book of Psalms will talk about God highlight and bless the righteous, judge the wicked, even amongst our own people. What Paul has is studied history. David foresees this, that God will judge the wicked, but he did not see and experience and study the divided kingdom, the prophets, the Assyrian captivity or the Babylonian captivity. He didn't see any of that. Paul would have been able to study what came by way of the broken covenant, so to say, by Israel, the divided kingdom, post-Solomon, where you have Rehoboam and Jeroboam and that breakdown, and then you have the 10 tribes of Israel and the 2 tribes of Judah, and then all of the just kind of craziness, the Assyrian captivity of 722 BC, the Babylonian captivity of 586 BC, all of the prophets, the restoration back into Jerusalem, the rebuilding of the wall with Nehemiah, the rebuilding of the temple with Ezra and Zerubbabel. Paul had study of all that, so he's able to say, did the Jewish people stumble beyond recovery? No, not at all. But because of this waywardness, not only from Old Testament history, but the rejection of Jesus, as we see in the Gospels, the pathway and the doorway of grace and mercy has been extended now to the Gentiles. So much so that the hope is that Israel sees the favor of God outside of themselves and they seek the Lord. To be envious is not to, oh, they're getting all my goods. It was that they might seek the Father once again. So chapter 9, as we had said, we said that Israel are a people of history, past, present, future. So let's lean into something here, because sometimes the question will be, okay, is everything that Israel does, is that okay? Is that allowable, so to say? And this raises a real massive question. And this raises what the concept that I'd mentioned earlier that sometimes people hold in the church regards it's commonly called replacement theology. And the idea was, has the church replaced the Jewish people as the favored of God? As though God can only love one group of people, as though God can only extend mercy to one group of people. And it's really interesting because you can have the same groups of people, you can have all people read Romans chapter 11 and come up with different conclusions. I'm going to tell you from my stance and what we teach with Bridgeway is we do not believe, and I do not teach replacement theology. The covenant of God still holds with Israel. The covenant of God still holds with the Jewish people. But as you'll see, I hope, it's not based on the people, it's based on God. It's based on Him. He's not a covenant breaker because people break covenant. Paul will write this in his letter with Timothy, and he will say that God is faithful, and if you or we are faithless, He still remains faithful. So let's just talk about past, present, future, because sometimes for us today, we can wrestle with, should I endorse everything that is Israel? I mean, if God is in covenant with Israel, does that mean that everything that comes from Israel is got a green stamp, so to say, has got a green check mark? And I would say absolutely not. We see in the Old Testament that God has a covenant and a love and a blessing for Israel, but they still reject Him, and God allows justice for them, so much so that there's captivity, there's hardship, there's lots of harsh discipline to them as a people. We come into the New Testament and the Gospels, and we find that they reject the Lord, and there's harsh justice that the Lord will bring towards that rejection. Just being biologically Jewish does not mean that subverts faith. So, but let's talk about historical Israel, what we'll call modern Israel and future Israel. So, historical Israel would be what we see in the scriptures, the good and the bad. And this is from the covenant of Abraham up to what Paul is writing in Romans. And certainly we could extend it beyond that, but we're studying Romans, so we're stopping there. From Abraham to Romans, what all has transpired for historical Israel. And there's history inside of that. From the kings, from the blessings, from land, from their sin, from the prophets, from judgment, from captivities, all of that we're able to see and study. And through it all, God still blesses or stays within covenant. Even when there's the Babylonian captivity for 70 years, most of the Jewish people who were alive of that day were in captivity within Babylon. And God is still extending grace. So you have prophets, Ezekiel's amongst that group, Daniel's amongst that group. Some of the prophets that come after them, Zephaniah and Zechariah and Haggai, and prophecies about God's restoration. Well, then we get into modern Israel. Modern Israel would be what we watch and call it present day, call it post-biblical times. And a lot of the history of Israel and the Jewish people has been very troubled and been very troubling. They've fought and defended themselves. They have been persecuted and had just tremendous amounts of opposition. And it has happened in the geography of Israel, and it's happened in the geography of other parts of the world in which their Jewishness was attacked in other parts of the world. And we can watch this through history. But just like with historical Israel, we shouldn't suggest that modern Israel has been sinless in everything. We don't have to turn a blind eye to say there have been some things that have been done wrongly or incorrectly, not wise, not godly. Just like we wouldn't say historical biblical Israel did everything godly. And that's not true at all. It's not true in the Old Testament. It's not true in the New Testament. Well, that brings us to future Israel. So future Israel is what is seen in both natural and prophetic considerations. So we have prophecies coming from the book of Daniel. We have prophecies certainly from Jesus in the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24:25. We have certainly the book of Revelation and things that will happen in the days ahead. Things that have not yet happened. And we know Israel's at the tip of the spear on end time events. It will be defined, Jeremiah calls the end time events Jacob's trouble. That's how he words it, Jacob's trouble. And as we know, Israel is Jacob. Jacob has his name changed to Israel, and the Israelites are the descendants of Jacob. The end times will have at the tip of the spear the Israelites. So we're able to see some of the things that Scripture says will happen in those prophecies that God says that He will redeem His people and He will show Himself. It's not just talking about church, it's talking about the Jewish community as a whole. So Paul's defense is that God has not broken covenant with Israel. Now, for us present day, does that mean that we have to say that every decision from every leader point out of Israel or Jewish is endorsed by God? Not at all. Paul didn't do that. David didn't do that. So we can watch some things that happen today and say, well, that's wrong and that's foolish and that's going to create all kinds of hardship and that stop it. But we can still stand with Israel. We can still stand with God and His covenant to people. But let's make sure that we're clear. God doesn't say that everything that happens from a people that presently are rejecting Him is going to be honoring to Him. So He will be sovereignly just. And He will also bring sovereign grace in time. Now, one of the things for us is we want to make sure that we don't find ourselves fighting God as we're making assessments about what happens in other parts of the world with, we'll call them God's people and other people. So I'll give you a story from Acts chapter 5. This is when the Sanhedrin were trying to rule on this early church movement of the disciples, and they're brought before, Peter and John are brought before the Sanhedrin, and a Pharisee named Gamaliel, this is the guy who Paul studied under, a teacher of the law who was honored by all the people. He stood up in the Sanhedrin, ordered that the men, being John and Peter, be taken outside for a little while, and then he's going to address them, and he's basically, I'm jumping to the red part, he's going to say, if their purpose is from God, you'll not be able to stop these men. You'll only find yourselves fighting against God. So it was the idea that he makes this proposal: stop fighting these people, because if God is with them, you'll only find yourself fighting the Lord. I think that's helpful for us in how should we approach Israel. Well, we're always going to stand with the Lord before we stand with anybody. We're going to honor what the Lord is doing and that he's faithful in all things. And I would hold from Romans 11 that he is absolutely still in covenant with Israel. So we'll stand with Israel, and we'll pray for Israel, and we'll pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and we'll pray for the peace of his people. But that does not mean that we can't watch some things and say that people who are presently rejecting Christ are making really not always the best of decisions. You have the right to have a sound mind about these things without kind of a blind eye to what isn't very godly or isn't very wise at certain times. So with that, let me keep going. Romans chapter 11 says, but if their transgressions mean riches for the world and their loss means riches for the Gentiles, how much greater riches will their fullness bring? So he's just pushing into, if they have rejected the Lord and their transgression meant that the grace of the Lord got extended to the Gentiles, then it says here their loss means riches for the Gentiles. How much greater riches will their fullness bring, like when God does restore them? Because he's about to talk about restoration for Israel one day, which will be in prophetic time period. He says, I'm talking to you Gentiles. So now he's turned to the Gentiles, and he's saying to Gentiles, I want you to understand that this has been to your benefit. And this is really important. I'm going to give some history around this church in just a second. He says, inasmuch as I am the apostle to the Gentiles, I love the Gentiles, I'm reaching the Gentiles. I make much of my ministry in the hope that I may somehow arouse my own people to envy and save some of them. So that red part is towards the Jewish person. I'm reaching out to the Gentile with the mercy of God and the gospel of Jesus Christ, and hopefully some of my own brothers will see that God is gracious and mercy to a people that had, call it, rejected him, and maybe that will cause our people, the Jewish people, to reach to him. So he is grabbing both groups. But he is telling the Gentiles now, he has spoken to the Jews, he's talking to the Gentiles, and he's saying, cool it. Cool it on your arrogance. Now, why do you say that, Joel? So let's dive into something that we have not touched yet. We did not touch it when we started in chapter 1. We're bringing it to this point. Let's talk about the dynamic and the DNA of the Roman church. So, how did it start? We did talk about this. In Acts chapter 2, at the day of Pentecost, it's very clearly defined that there were people, there were Jews from Rome that were there. And scholars across for centuries have held that those were the ones that brought the gospel of Jesus Christ back to Rome and began this church. So keep that in mind. It would have started primarily Jewish. However, in 50 AD, and you can read your history up on this, there's an edict from Claudius. You'll remember the famous emperors of, Caligula and Claudius and Nero. Well, in Claudius's reign in 50 AD, there was an edict that all Jews had to leave Rome. So we have evidence of this in Acts chapter 18, verse 2, when Paul comes into the acquaintance of Priscilla and Aquila. And it says that they had come because they had been basically kicked out of Rome because of the edict from Claudius. The other thing that we would add is that by the time that Paul is writing this letter, and we've dealt with the timeline of this, right? We've already leaned into this, that he is in Corinth and he writes this letter somewhere around 57 AD. So somewhere over this, call it 7-year window, Jews had begun to return to Rome, okay? So let me show you something. The way this church would have started, it was founded by Jews and therefore predominantly Jewish. And anybody coming in, any Gentiles coming in, would have had to follow the way of Judaism. They were accommodating of Gentiles as they were getting saved and joining. And so what should be required of a Gentile who is saved but in the company of Jews in a synagogue in Rome that is primarily Jewish? But then it's abandoned by the Jews AD 50. No question about it. This is just straight history. Therefore, the church becomes almost exclusively Gentile. The church in Rome was almost exclusively Gentile. And then by the time that Paul is writing to them, Jews had been returning, and you have a mixture of Gentile and Jew in the Roman church. Now think about that. You have a category of people as Jews who are like, hey, we started this place. This started in our synagogue. And then you have Gentiles who are now in the leadership of it and have been for a handful of years. And so there is a disparity as to who leads here, who defines doctrine here, who defines what we do. And you could have Jews who come in and say, we're the favored of God, we're the blessing of God, we're the elect and the chosen one. And you could have Gentiles and say, wait a minute, God has rejected the Jew. God has rejected Israel. And so Paul is having to give context and explanation to both groups of people that God's mercy and grace, his faithfulness, righteousness, justice, and mercy is still extended to both groups. So it's with that this kind of carries into this next section. For if their rejection, being the Jews, is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? And then he goes into visuals, like how do I depict this? How do I show you? And he starts grabbing visuals. If the part of the dough offered as first fruits is holy, then the whole batch is holy. He's grabbing onto a visual from the Old Testament about how an offering was given at a first fruit offering. This is going all the way back to Leviticus and how were offerings given. He's going to continue with another visual of a tree and a root. If the root is holy, so are the branches. If some of the branches have been broken off, and you, though a wild olive shoot, have been grafted in among the others, and now sharing the nourishing sap from the olive root, do not boast about those over those branches. If you do, consider this: you do not support the root, but the root supports you. So what's the idea here? He's depicting the wild olive shoot. You're the Gentiles. Gentiles, you're the wild olive shoot. And just because some of the branches of the tree have been broken off, well, the root of Israel's God. The root of Israel is his covenant. It's not, this particular person or that particular person. It's the covenant of God even before it was of Abraham. It's God extending covenant, and the root of who he is and the root of his covenant, and the fact that he did this for the Jewish people. And he's using visuals. I won't go into it, but how a gardener or a botanist in Israel would often take different branches and branches that weren't producing and put them into the sap of a trunk that was producing, or that a wild shoot could be brought in. It could be grafted into the trunk, and There's a lot that's been written about from botanists in Israel, how effective this is to be able to grow shoots and grow fruit. And Paul's just grabbing this visual because it's very central to who Israel was. It's a visual for Israel, but also depicting that God has the capacity. The real emphasis here isn't about the wild branch or the wild root or wild olive shoot. It's not about the branch. It really is the gardener, the botanist, who is able to make things grow. So watch how this kind of continues on. It says, you will say then, branches were broken off so that I could be grafted in. Branches of Jewishness, the Israelites, so that Gentiles could be grafted into the plan and the blessings and the heir, being co-heirs with Christ, as he's already said. Paul says, granted, but they were broken off because of unbelief, and you stand by faith. So he's saying, Gentiles, don't be arrogant. Don't be arrogant like you're the tree. You're not. You were grafted in. He says, don't be arrogant, but be afraid. What does he mean by be afraid? He's just talking here about to be humble, to be cautious, to not overreach, to not be arrogant to the Jews. Like, hey, you guys, y'all got judged by God. How dare you try and come back in? Don't be arrogant. You were a recipient of mercy. You were grafted in. So understand that the gardener, the botanist, can graft even the branches back in. He's going to say that. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he'll not spare you either. Don't get high and mighty. Don't get arrogant, whether you're a Jew or a Gentile. Consider, therefore, the kindness and sternness of God. Sternness to those who fail, but kindness to you, provided that you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. Once again, he is not talking about the loss of salvation. This is not a statement about losing salvation. This is about the gardener who is able to make all things grow in the way that he determines. So keep going. It continues in this. If they do not persist in unbelief, Jewish people, Israel, they will be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. This is about God. This is about his covenant. This is about him as the gardener. Jesus says real clearly, John 15, that my Father's the gardener. He says, I'm the vine, you're the branches. And if you remain in me and you remain in my words, you'll bear much fruit. But if you don't remain in me, you won't bear any fruit. And it'll be like a branch that needs to be pruned and needs to be cut off. This is very much picturesque of John chapter 15, where really the gardener is able to do all things. After all, if you were cut off, verse 24, after all, if you were cut off an olive tree that is wild by nature and contrary to nature were grafted into a cultivated olive tree, so wild by nature, Gentiles. Cultivated olive tree, Israel. Promises or the promises of God, the covenant of God. How much more readily will these natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? How much more can God take any person, Jew or Gentile, who is saying yes by faith and grafting them in to the covenant of God, the blessing under Christ, co-heirs with him? He says this, he's continuing in the same concept. I don't want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers, so that you may not be conceited. Like, I do not want you to be arrogant. I don't want you to miss and think somehow you're the priority. Come back to the church for just a second. Jews returning, Gentiles leading in a place that was originally started by Jews. Who's in charge of this place? Who has the blessing of God? Who has the favor of God? Who has the mandate of God? And Paul's saying, guys, calm all that down. This is all about the Father. This is all about his goodness, and I don't want you to become conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. And so that's very much picturesque of end times kind of stuff. And we're not going to do a deep dive on Revelation here, but he's talking about when the time of the Gentile is completed. And that's not to say that Gentiles, you're touching into rapture, you're touching into end time. This gets into Revelation with the bowls and the trumpets. So I'm just going to stay on task, keep going. Verse 26, and so all Israel will be saved, as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He'll turn godlessness away from Jacob. Remember Jacob's trouble. And this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. It's really clear, I think, when I read Romans 11, that God is still in covenant with his people, even though he has allowed them, following sovereign faithfulness, sovereign righteousness, allows for sovereign justice. There still will be sovereign grace that is extended for his name. And when it says all Israel will be saved, it's not talking about all past Israel. It's not talking about it's not even just talking about all biological Israel, because it will not go, hear me on this, it will not go to a situation in which biology trumps faith. Even in end times, even when Daniel's visions are playing out, and even when the book of Revelation, bowls, trumpets, all of that stuff is happening, it will still be faith. It will not be because I was biologically someone. So when it's saying that all Israel will be saved, there will be a national evangelization, so to say, a national enlightenment of Jesus as Messiah. And Paul here is pulling from Isaiah 59 when he is writing this. And I'll talk about Isaiah 59, just keep this in mind. I'll talk about something with that later. As far as the gospel is concerned, they are enemies on your account. But as far as election is concerned, they are loved on account of the patriarchs, for God's gifts and his call are irrevocable. So for the gospel concerned, the Israelites that rejected the Lord, well, they're enemies on your account so that you received grace and you received to the Gentiles. As far as election is concerned, as far as God's choosing them, well, they're still loved according to the account of the patriarchs. So what does that mean? It's, in my understanding, as clear as I can see this, it is God's statement of, because he's still in covenant with what he prophesied or spoke over Abraham. I will bless you and you'll be my people. So when it's talking about patriarchs, it's talking all the way back to the account of Abraham. And God's gifts and call are irrevocable. Now, in church world, we'll use that, I feel called to serve in this ministry. Well, the call of God and the gifts of God are irrevocable. And I'm not saying that that doesn't somewhat fit, but understand that that verse is depicting with Israel and covenant all the way back to Abraham. So all that said, to come to these last two slides, just as you were at one time disobedient to God, have now received mercy as a result of their disobedience. So he's talking to Gentiles here. He's like going back and forth, Jews and Gentiles. As a result of their disobedience, so they too now have become disobedient in order that they too may now receive mercy as a result of God's mercy to you. So it's a Jew-Gentile kind of scenario where he's saying, Gentiles, God's given you mercy, and now he's going to give them mercy on account of you. You received mercy on account of them, and the time is coming where they will receive mercy on account of you. And he says, for God has bound all men over to disobedience so that he may have mercy on them all. So once again, that's one of those, okay, is God acting inappropriately? Not at all. He's depicting that when somebody rejects the Lord, he extends mercy to another. And in the time of grace, in the time of his justice and grace, because of this favor to this direction, he will eventually give mercy and grace to these people. But not because biology. Once again, it really is a matter of faith. So let me kind of bring it home with these last verses. And I know that there's a lot that we've covered here. Paul understands that all of this, the whole chapter, but not just the chapter, it's 9, 10, and 11, that whole package of sovereignty, that it's really deep and it's really complex in some regards. Oh, the depths of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God. Like, this isn't an easy puzzle to solve. This isn't easy to think about. He is trying to put it in very simple terms, but it's a deep thing, and it's the wisdom of God. And he's going to give visual, how unsearchable his judgments and the paths beyond tracing out. Like, what he does is beyond you and me. He would say to the Gentiles, this is beyond your understanding and beyond your capacity. To the Jews, this is beyond your understanding and beyond your capacity. This is God, and he's deep, but he's also reaching somewhere. He says in verse 34, who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? That comes from Isaiah 40. So I'll come back to that. Who has ever given to God that God should repay him? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. So let me lean on this Isaiah 40 part. So he comes off of all of that, right? And he defines with Isaiah chapter 40. So I'm going to go ahead and come out of this image, but let me just kind of talk about it. So I talked with our church this past Sunday, if you're watching this in real time to where we are in August of 2025. If you're watching at a later time, it was a message that was given Saturday at our Saturday service and our Sunday services, which would have been on the 17th, Saturday the 16th and Saturday the 17th of August 2025. And I talked about how scholars often will take Isaiah and say that Isaiah is like a mini Bible. And the reason that it's considered like a mini Bible is because you have 66 books in the Bible, right? Well, in Isaiah, you have 66 chapters, okay? So in your Bible, you have 39 Old Testament chapters, or Old Testament books, and they're dealing with the sovereignty of God, the nature of God, his blessing, but also talking about his righteousness and justice. And there's certainly grace and there's certainly mercy, but you see the justice of God in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, you have 27 books, and you see the redemption story of God and the restoration of grace to people and mercy extended, okay? Well, when you look at the book of Isaiah, of those 66 books, the first 39 are dealing with basically the judgment and the righteousness of God, that God has been rejected, and there's a righteousness that's going to bring about justice to that righteousness and the wickedness of the people. Well, the last 27 chapters are dealing with the restoration of God's people and the redeeming and the remnant and all of these things. It's in that last section that we have so many of the messianic prophecies. So when we read in Isaiah 59 and we read about his grace and his outpouring and him saving everybody, it's in that restoration period. Well, also in Isaiah chapter 40, where we read about real famous passage about, that they that wait on the Lord will renew their strength, and they'll mount up with wings as eagles, and they'll run and not grow weary, and walk and not be faint, right? The way chapter 40 starts is comfort, comfort my people. That's the first verse, and it's this Hebrew word, nacham. It means like to breathe. So it's as though he's bringing breath, in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 1. In this last 27 chapters, the redemption and the restoration of the people. And it's there in chapter 40 that you're going to get this statement about who has known the mind of the Lord, who can search out his wisdom. And it's the idea that his understanding is beyond ours. And from that is this launch into the restoration of people. So certainly in Romans chapter 12, we see as things are turning. We see that in the book of Isaiah, we see Paul in chapter 12 grabbing hold of the start of that redemption story section of prophecy. And it's really profound, I think, not just the statement that he's using and pulling from Isaiah, but the whole concept of what's coming from chapter 40 to chapter 26 is carried out, I think, in Paul's consideration of saying that he will win Israel. And he has done a marvelous thing with the Gentile. And when we pull away from it, once again, what is our responsibility? Are we supposed to side exclusively with Israel on all things? Are we supposed to side exclusively towards the church? I don't think in any regards that's what Paul's talking about. Paul is talking about God and his faithfulness, God and his goodness, and God the one who keeps covenant. And just like he keeps covenant with Israel, he keeps covenant with you and me, even though we err and miss the mark from time to time. And we can know that we are the recipients of grace. And we can't say that we're the recipients of grace, but others don't get to receive the mercy and the grace of the Lord also. He's a covenant-keeping God. He's always faithful. He's always righteous. He's always just, and he's always gracious. And he'll be that in your life as well. So from all of that, that's a look at Romans chapter 9, 10, and 11 and the sovereignty of God. Now, off of this, he's going to come into a real famous passage that we'll start into next week, Romans chapter 12, verse 1, and he's going to say, therefore, in light of all that, in light of everything from the doctrine of salvation that we had earlier into his covenant with his people, chapter 9, 10, and 11, let us therefore, chapter 12, verse 1, let us therefore present our bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. And then we'll build into it and study that as we go. So, hey, hope this has been a good study for you. I hope you'll take it further than we've had time, because there's a lot in the material that we've covered. And I hope that the Lord will bless your studies. And I'll see you on the next one with Romans chapter 12. God bless you.